Good afternoon. I'm Robin Wilt, Brighton Town Board member and 2020 candidate for Congress in New York's 25th Congressional District. I want to thank you for joining us today for another COVID-19 community check-in and update. These are updates in which we highlight the issues facing some of our most vulnerable community members and try to raise awareness and build action around moving forward through this pandemic together with no one left behind. Today, we're going to focus on climate justice. And just in background, in June 2019, New York State enacted the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is arguably the most comprehensive and ambitious climate action plan in the nation. The bill, which was championed by State Senator Todd Kaminsky, is the first major legislation in New York State to embrace elements of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal, including the plan's emphasis on using environmental law to help low-income communities. New York's law intends to funnel potentially tens of millions of dollars into economically disadvantaged areas around the state, particularly those that have been devastated by pollution and other industrial byproducts. In addition, it codified into law several earlier initiatives of Governor Cuomo's, including greatly increasing New York's offshore wind goals, solar deployment, and energy storage. Now, supporters say that the mandates handed down will likely require a vast workforce to weatherize homes, swap out furnaces, and install solar panels, and build wind farms and other clean energy infrastructure. Julie Tai, the president of New York League of Conservation Voters, said this law will spur growth of green jobs across the state for decades, while State Senator Kaminsky said the measure would change the way every New Yorker lives. Now, the CLCPA started out as the Climate and Community Protection Act, the CCPA, until Governor Cuomo who had originally introduced his own plan that called for decarbonizing the electric sector and forming a council to study the issue of economy-wide decarbonization, struck a compromise with the state legislature on the bill. Now, overall, environmental justice organizations have described the CLCPA as a strong climate bill, but no longer a climate justice bill. New York Renews, a coalition of more than 180 environmental justice, faith, labor, and community groups, was instrumental in passing this legislation. And they had this to say. Ultimately, the Community Leadership and Community Protection Act is a partial victory for New Yorkers. The fight for true climate justice demands transformative change, and we will bring that fight until our communities win. Another commenter from New York Renews added, you can't address climate change without addressing environmental justice, racial justice, and economic justice. But we're feeling pretty good about the guardrails we got in. Now, today to talk about all things environmental justice, we're joined by Sue Hughes-Smith, who is an adjunct professor of environmental health at SUNY Brockport, and Anna Cerosaletti, Rochester Field Director for New York Youth Climate Leaders. Welcome to the Facebook Live to the both of you.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks for having us. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. I want to hop right in here. First of all, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourselves and talk in greater detail about your community involvement. Shall we start with you, Sue?
Sure, happy to. So I have been an adjunct professor of environmental health at SUNY Brockport for the last 13 years. And in addition to that, I helped to co-found the Rochester People's Climate Coalition, and from that also went on to form a small business focused on bringing renewable energy to our communities through community choice aggregation, which is another kind of state-approved program. So I really welcome the conversation on environmental justice because it is a key part of the conversation that is often overlooked.
Thank you so much. And Anna?
Yeah, so as Robin said, I'm Anna Cerosaletti, and I'm associated with the New York Youth Climate Leaders, which is a coalition of over, I believe, 55 youth organizations from across the state. It's a youth-led coalition that fights for policy in New York State. And so I'm the Rochester field director, and it's a really amazing group that fights for really specific policy on the state level.
Well, thank you again for joining us. And it is very nice that the climate movement, particularly in this area, is so strongly youth-led. And I know that I've attended a number of marches that, again, were youth organized and whatnot. I want to ask, though, well, maybe we'll go with Anna first in this case. How is the crisis affecting your organizing, since so much of it was focused on marches and strikes and whatnot?
Yeah, absolutely. So, COVID-19 has flipped everything upside down. And with organizing, it sort of depends on what group. So the Rochester Youth Climate Leaders is another group that I'm part of that's really active in Rochester. And they're a member of the New York Youth Climate Leaders Coalition, but they meet in person generally. And so that's been difficult moving that online. And that group also has a lot of younger members, younger students, fourth and fifth graders, even younger than that sometimes. And so it's been difficult to coordinate within that group. The New York Youth Climate Leaders, we have representation across the state, Long Island to Buffalo. So we were doing everything mostly digital beforehand. We meet through Zoom every weekend and on different team calls, which I think we're really lucky in that we already had that experience going into the into the coronavirus crisis. And so that's very lucky. However, Earth Week, which was just last week, we had plans for an Albany mobilization where there would be a rally as well as a in-person lobby day. And we held a digital lobby day, which was a huge success. We had a lot of participation, and everyone seemed to have really positive experiences, which was amazing. But of course, our in-person mobilization was unable to happen, which is unfortunate. But I think that this does present an opportunity to work on our digital connections and our ability to still engage in the legislative process through the internet.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would agree. Of course, I'm on the town board in Brighton, and most of our environmentally friendly community organization, our recycling programs, they were supposed to take place during May, and we've had to cancel those, and that was a huge disappointment. But we're committed to working in other ways. So Sue, can you elaborate on some of the ways that we're still working on making progress on these environmental goals, even though we're not able to physically be together?
Sure. I think in terms of organizing for our older populations, what I'm hearing from a lot of folks who are, retired or in that age bracket is that they're really doing a lot of reflecting and kind of reevaluating both their involvement and their own personal priorities. And it's opened some space, I think, emotionally and mentally for people to do some learning that they hadn't had time for before. And a lot of organizations are stepping up, providing additional, webinars and other learning opportunities, which I think is all really valuable. And I know the older folks who have been less, comfortable with our technologies are really learning Zoom and some of these other platforms, which will be very beneficial moving into the future for sure. In terms of programmatically, it's challenging. I think both because the rules for how can we move forward on a practical level with things like CCA outreach, right? The Green Choice Aggregation Outreach has to be approved by the Public Service Commission. So while we are offering input and strategies and a plan, then it just is another slowdown, because we'll have to wait for their approval before we can proceed fully into the next step. But the good news is everybody recognizes the need to have an alternative, and those steps are slowly moving forward.
That's great. obviously this was a crisis long before COVID-19 ever reared its head. But have you seen any other environmental concerns that have been highlighted as a result of the pandemic?
So to me, the biggest benefit, if you would, is that this pandemic has made it clear to many people who have not had to deal with the fact that there's a lot of pollution. When pollution isn't equally shared.
Right.
Okay. And the impacts of that pollution is not equally shared. And that's what environmental justice is all about. So you have African American communities that are 3 times as likely to die from air pollution than a white community. And that's not new, right? And the COVID situation where people are like, drawing attention to the fact that the African American community is having a greater loss of life is revealing to folks who had been able to be unaware that it's bringing that to their attention. And hopefully people will begin to understand that this isn't unique to COVID, right? This is a regular occurrence in America because all levels of government have allowed polluting facilities to locate in both low income, but also within communities that are less white. And so it disproportionately puts the burden on people of color. And so they're more sick from COVID because they're more sick already, and they're more sick for no fault of their own. And that I hope people will begin to understand that.
Yeah, not only are they more sick, but they're put in circumstances, environmental circumstances that are just that render them more at risk. So yeah, that's a very important point to make. Thank you. And Anna, have you seen more efforts to organize across communities during the pandemic, and specifically communities that are perhaps considered frontline communities? Have you seen, because we're transitioning to virtual efforts, that has been one of the outcomes?
Yeah, I'd say that, of course, within, the climate movement and with climate justice, we're always looking to involve frontline communities and, of course, help them in whatever way we can and also fight for them. But I'd say definitely, going along with what Sue said, it's the coronavirus pandemic has brought attention to these communities, as well as been a distraction at the same time. And it's unfortunate that it's a distraction. I think it's really important to point out the connections there between the pandemic and the public health crisis that the climate crisis is. And so I think that, there's definitely been efforts to reach out to those communities right now with helping them with the COVID pandemic, as well as helping them to bring them into the climate movement and really hear their voices and what they need within this crisis.
Great. Yeah. Now, are there specific ways that the climate justice movement can leverage this crisis so that we make sure that we all come out of this ahead, as opposed to further certain communities further marginalized and these disparities actually accentuated?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, the climate movement has a huge opportunity here with the coronavirus pandemic, and in fact leveraging it to make the point that, this is a pandemic and it's really bad and it's really awful, but the climate crisis is just as bad and worse. We need to, there are major similarities between the coronavirus pandemic and the climate crisis, and just the fact that they're both public health crises. And the coronavirus pandemic has pointed out a lot of the weak parts of our systems here in the US, and where do we need to strengthen those in order to prepare for the climate crisis, and what do we need to put into action to fight it? And I think that, just that connection is so powerful that, we are seeing this now and we are seeing the weaknesses now, but, it's just going to get worse. We have to make changes to prepare for that and to fight against that.
Yeah, Anna, you make a very important point, and that's is our mutuality in all of this. The pandemic is something that affects us regardless of age, regardless of income, regardless of socioeconomic status. It really does impact every single one of us. And the same is true of the climate crisis, even though we don't often consider it in that way. And also, you highlight, Anna, that it's going to take massive mobilization, and it has taken massive mobilization, as we see another 3.9 million people filing for unemployment during the pandemic. It's taking all of our efforts to try to mitigate the effects of the pandemic on our communities. Sue, do you have anything to add in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. You remember, in 2008, when we had the Great Recession, we missed the opportunity to steer stimulus money towards things that would benefit us as a nation long term. Activists were really disheartened by that and have been organizing since then to prevent that from happening in the future. So we really need to seize this moment as a community. People of color and their allies really need to come together around getting federal money directed towards ways that will protect us and improve our lives and all of our lives. And that's really very possible.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I so strongly support an environmental justice framework for addressing climate change, because we do have these frontline communities that are more critically impacted by these systems. So we talked a little bit about the statewide climate legislation. And I want to put it in context of the Green New Deal, which was very much considered aspirational. Can you talk about the intersection between the state level legislation and the Green New Deal, and how it really merges that notion of environmental justice, reinforces that notion? And either of you can tackle that first.
So you can go ahead.
Okay, fine. Well, so in the state level, you're absolutely right that it is the most ambitious piece of climate legislation in the country. The downside is there's no funding mechanism. So while it is aspirational, and climate and Cuomo kind of watered it down, right? Under the previous version, 40% of revenue would be directed into EJ communities. Under the actual bill that was passed, it's 35% of the benefits. And I want people to realize that that is a very slippery slope. It opens up an opportunity to really kind of play some games with how we evaluate benefits and how much resources actually gets directed into EJ communities. So we're going to have to also, in the state, be very engaged in monitoring and advocating for the proper implementation of this law. And we just cannot, we can't take a rest there. The other piece is we have to get a funding mechanism in place. There's a bill, the Climate and Community Investment Act, that has been before the legislature for several years, would do just that by creating a tax on carbon polluters and other polluters that are disproportionately impacting frontline communities. And then it would redirect that money into making our economy green, protecting workers who will lose their job, and repairing the damage that has been done to certain communities over time. So that's the state level. So how does that compare to the Green New Deal? Very similarly, right? So the Green New Deal, as best outlined, really is Sanders' plan. And that would take massive investment, as the New Deal did, created, an alphabet soup of programs and a funding mechanism, which people should realize that the federal government through the New Deal didn't just spend money and it disappear, but they got all that money back and then some. So it's like $500 million or something of like additional profit. It was a good investment for the country. And there is no reason that wouldn't be true with a Green New Deal. In Sanders' plan, he goes further to not just say we need to address the economy becoming green and carbon free, but that we also need to really remake our rural economies, moving it away from kind of the corporate destructive practices we have today to more resilient, family-centered future. But hopefully that gives you an idea of the intersection.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do like the frame that you've illustrated there, really, that it is an economic development plan. It is a stimulus plan, and it's a stimulus plan that is people first, as opposed to handing money over to corporations and asking them to do a good job for us. This is actually investing in people, investing in the labor force, investing in our communities. So that's an important distinction to make. And speaking of our communities and who's actually in the front line of this environmental movement, young people have been leaders in this regard. And so I want to switch back to Anna here. How did you first get involved in environmental organizing, and what brings you to the movement?
So, for me, getting involved was really just like a staircase. Like, I got involved in one group, and then I was going to get involved in another one, and then I started doing this for this group. And so, I mean, what really motivated me to get involved was like a legitimate fear of climate change, right? It's an existential crisis to this day. It still scares me, and that's why I'm involved. Like, it's that actual, it's an actual fear of it. And so I'm motivated by that because I know that it's my only option. It's the only way that I have to, protect myself and protect my children's future, my grandchildren's future, right? And so I, the first, I was involved in my school's environmental club, and I got more involved in that. And, I got involved in the Rochester Youth Climate Leaders, and then the New York Youth Climate Leaders was formed. And I became a part of their leadership team. And it's just been over time, my involvement has grown. And, it's a networking thing too, is just getting to know more people. And it's the motivation is, how do I protect myself and my children's future? And, building a community around that and fighting for what we need.
That's great. That's great. So what advice would you give to others who want to get more involved in the environmental movement and in the work to try to mitigate this crisis?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing is just reaching out to people. If there's somebody that you think is really cool and they're doing really cool work, reach out and find out how you can get involved. Like, people within the movement are so willing to bring you in and get you involved and have you help. Like, just in any way, there's always somewhere where you can help or you can apply your skills. Maybe you're not great at lobbying, but you're really good at art. So you can, there's ways to get involved. And, specifically with like New York Youth Climate Leaders, following us on Instagram, and through our Instagram, where NY2CL is our Instagram and Facebook handle, I think. I think our handles are all the same at this point. But, through that platform, we share a lot of what we're working on, and it links you to our website through those platforms, so you can check us out there. There's so many ways to get involved with that group specifically. We have so many different initiatives going on right now. And so, just reaching out is the biggest thing. There's always ways to get involved, and people are always willing to help you get involved.
Great. Thank you for that. So we got those handles. And Sue, I know that you are not one of the youth in the movement. You've been at this for a long time. Have you seen the movement evolve at all over that time frame?
Oh, definitely. I think it's still largely a white movement, certainly generationally. But the younger generation that's getting more involved is increasingly diverse, which I think is really exciting. And I think the youth are doing perhaps a better job of creating space for those voices to be adequately heard. Um, but the movement overall is becoming more conscious of issues of environmental justice, and I think it's really an opportunity for the community to grow in their understanding of structural racism, of how so many of us have been indoctrinated into a racial culture. And that gives us an opportunity to then move forward and find avenues to be more inclusive. I think I see people moving in that direction, which is exciting.
That is exciting. So, as we highlight some of these communities who are disparately impacted by our systems and structures, can you tell me a little bit more about like the pollution movement and the movement to hold polluters accountable and invest in our communities, and maybe the farm workers and agricultural communities and how they're involved in the movement?
A little bit. The biggest problem is that when we elected Trump president, he began rolling back all kinds of environmental rules and regulations. And people need to understand that most of our environmental rules are public health rules. Were put in place to protect the general public from having dirty air, dirty water, and toxic exposure. I think many people mistake environment for, oh, we're protecting animals. Yeah, well, of the 60 some rules that Trump has rolled back, only 7 of them had anything to do with animals at all, but 16 had to do with air pollution, and 10 for increased drilling, and 11 for toxic exposures. So, they really are about protecting public health. And it has been a real wake up call to our society at large to watch this president roll back almost 95 different rules and regulations. So, that I think at least helps create some energy, a lot of energy around resistance and about mobilizing and how can we do better. And in that process, people become more aware of the uneven burden that people are feeling or experiencing within our society. And some of the most vulnerable people are, of course, our farm workers, many of whom are undocumented and really taken advantage of throughout the system. And there's efforts to organize them, I know, locally, at least in New York, and that's been really helpful.
Yeah, it's so important that you highlight some of these systems that are being effective, some of the policy, some of the headway that we've made over the decades that are now under threat under the current administration, like rolling back of the Environmental Protection Agency's ability to hold polluters to account, and also the us pulling back from the Paris Climate Accords and a lot of the global communities that have been so instrumental in improving our efforts towards decarbonization. So I want to ask you both, you have anything else to close with, to add to our discussion?
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would close with is that people think that this is a monumental task that couldn't happen, but it's very doable. And although there are all kinds of different economists that have different ideological slants, most estimate that you could decarbonize the US economy with 1% of GDP, which really is not very much of the total economy. Other estimates are like 10 to 30% of subsidies that we now give to fossil fuel companies, like taxpayer dollars that we just give to fossil fuel companies to make us sick and cause climate change. If you redirected that to renewables, we could decarbonize the country very quickly. So we know what we need to do, and it is financially feasible to do it. We just have to choose to do it. And that's where we come in.
Yeah. I mean, Nelson Mandela said it best. It always seems impossible until it's done.
Yeah.
So we just have to get it done. Anna, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, definitely reiterating what Stu said. It's doable, and we have, especially I feel it in the youth movement. Especially coming off of the high that Earth Week is. There's a lot of energy right now, and there's a lot of youth that are looking to get involved, and just in general, that I think that we have solutions that we have ready to put into action, and there's energy too in the youth movement that are ready to push for that and help with that.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for joining me today. COVID-19 is a crisis within many ongoing crises, and among which the climate crisis is probably the biggest looming existential threat in our lifetimes and the lifetimes of future generations. So I want to thank you both for being out there on the front lines in this fight. I want to thank you for joining me today and making those connections and highlighting how intersectional this issue is. Again, we are with you in this fight, and thank you for everything you do.
Thank you, Robin, for not forgetting this important issue as well.
Yes, thank you.
You're very welcome. All right, have a great afternoon, folks.
You too.